Welcome to Learning from Latin America, Transitional Justice Successes, a webinar hosted by the Mary Hoke Center for Reconciliation at George Mason University. My name is Amanda Pena, and I am the Communications Officer here at MHCR. This evening, I am honored to present two experts in the field, Dr. Jo Marie Burt, Associate Professor at the Schar School at George Mason University, and Eduardo Gonzalez, MHCR Research Affiliate and Think Peace Learning Support Hub Convener. Today, we're going to be talking about transitional justice in Latin America. I'm going to provide some brief context to set the scene. So TJ, transitional justice, came to be in the late 80s, early 90s as a response to the political changes in Latin America and Eastern Europe regions. Countries in these regions wanted justice from the abuses suffered under regimes in the regions without jeopardizing the political transformations at the time from the regimes to democracies. It can be argued that the Cold War created and exacerbated a fear of communism among the countries. No one wanted for communism to spread. So in the 1980s, the US military created the National Security Doctrine as a way to prevent the spread of communism within the region of the Americas, identifying the nation, state, and armed forces as one being. This doctrine was created as a way to keep the nation state as the main focus in the realm of national security. It opposed the idea of a liberal democracy where the primary focus is on the individual, because the US government believed that a liberal democracy would not be able to defend the state from communism. According to the International Center for Transitional Justice is defined as a response to systematic or widespread violations of human rights. It recognizes the victims and promotes possibilities of peace, reconciliation, and democracy. It's to help communities heal from the trauma experience, but also keep perpetrators accountable for their actions. So I want to quickly go over a couple case studies, if that's cool with you guys. And Eduardo and Dr. Burt, feel free to jump in whenever. I was trying to get a snapshot of each case study as much as I could because we only have so much time. Firstly, I want to discuss Argentina and the Dirty War. The Dirty War took place after the successful coup d'etat in 1976 that replaced the Argentine government with a military junta. So for the next 8 years, the country experienced a great depth of violence and trauma, and the military officials became large parts of civil society. In total, there were 30,000 missing Argentines as a result of the military junta taking individuals from their homes, off the streets, from schools and universities, and their jobs. Individuals were tortured, abused, and killed. Argentina eventually transitioned back into democracy in 1983, where the new president, Raúl Alfonsín, created a National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, which is CONADEP, as a way to try and keep a record of the disappeared. So while this may have been difficult since many of the disappearances have gone unreported, this may arguably be one of the most significant steps taken in order to heal a country, because CONADEP did not hold the military and political officials accountable for the harms caused, but the community did themselves. For example, you had Las Madres de la Plaza Mayor, which were a group of mothers who would come and protest and ask government officials where the disappeared were. Where were they being held? And then you also had Las Abuelas de la Plaza Mayor. Same concept, but it's with the grandmothers instead of the mothers. So in 1985, the trial of the military junta leaders began. Between 1987 and 1990, there were military uprisings followed by the creation of amnesty laws for the country. Between 1990 and 2003, there was a period of impunity and resistance to the amnesty laws. In 2005, the Supreme Court declared those amnesty laws to be unconstitutional. And as a result, In 2006, a new wave of criminal prosecutions occurred, and Argentina became the first country in Latin America to successfully try and convict almost 900 of those perpetrators of the dirty war. And that was through the testimonies of survivors and the push to keep those accountable for their actions. The next snapshot I will give of an example of where TJ was being used was in Guatemala. In 1971, there was a democratically elected president, Colonel Jacob Arbenz, who was overthrown by a military coup and was replaced by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. Arbenz was publicly against the use of banana republics and wanted to reform economic inequality in the country. Guatemala is an oligarchic country. It was and it still is now. So when Arbenz forcefully took office, he reversed the reforms Arbenz had put into the place for the indigenous and poor farmers and declared the removal of voting rights for Guatemalans who couldn't read. In the 1960s, the US military taught the Guatemalan army counterinsurgency methods as a way to prevent communism within the country. From 1960 to 1996, Guatemala experienced a civil war between the government and many leftist rebel groups. More than 200,000 Guatemalans were killed, most of them being the Mayan indigenous people of the country. The Civil War was said to be fought because the government was combating the emergence of guerrilla groups and claimed that they wanted to protect the state. But during the period of the Civil War, there were 626 massacres in the country. The Guatemalan government hid important police documents that would publicly point fingers at perpetrators of the violence. But after advocates for justice and reparations for Guatemala pushed for the release of the documents, they were made public. Guatemala is a country with lots of impunity. Many people have not been held accountable for their roles in the harm caused, but the indigenous people began to demand justice for themselves because they weren't aware they had the same rights as everyone else in the country. And one of the biggest wins was the trial and convictions of 2 military officials of the Siempre Sarco massacre. This took place in a small town in Guatemala. And this is where the government came in and wanted to take the land from the people. The people had said no. And the government claimed that these people were communists and many of those people were killed. Many women were held, raped and tortured because of this, and it instilled fear in the town. And it's highly noted, or it's one of the more memorable, noted ones because people were being held accountable for their actions. And yes, so today, Dr. Burt and Eduardo will discuss the topic of TJ further within 3 major themes: the psychosocial aspect of transitional justice and its impact, transitional justice processes and their successes and failures, and how transitional justice can be used in the US. Now, I would like to ask the discussants for brief introductions of the work that they do before we get into the questions.
I'll start, I guess. So hello, everybody. First of all, I just should say I'm Jo Marie Burt. I teach at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason. And I'm especially delighted to be here with my dear friend, Eduardo Gonzalez, and my former student, Amanda Peña, who was in my government and politics in Latin America class several years ago, and then in my course on human rights and transitional justice in Latin America a couple of years ago. So there's nothing more exciting for a professor to see one of their students actually talking about stuff we covered in class and talking about it, intelligently and insightfully. So I'm really thrilled. It's really great to be with both of you and the rest of you today. So I teach comparative politics in Latin America, American politics, at George Mason. I teach courses on human rights and transitional justice. I've taught some courses on policing in the Americas, racism and policing in the Americas. So yeah, I also am a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, which is an NGO based here in Washington, D.C. that advocates for more effective human rights concerns in U.S. policy in Latin America and in the region in general. And I've done a lot of I've done a lot of work on transitional justice, but my research has mostly focused on the kinds of criminal prosecutions that Amanda was talking about a moment ago, mostly in Peru and in Guatemala. Like Eduardo, I worked on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru, and I think truth commissions are absolutely an essential part of this process. But my research has taken me in the direction of looking at a little bit more of the criminal prosecution. So I'd be delighted to talk about that. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Burt. Oh,
I think he froze for a minute, and now I think we lost him. Hopefully he can come back in.
he's back.
There we go.
All right, sorry about that. I got cut out for a minute. Well, my name is Eduardo Gonzalez. I am a sociologist from Peru. I, as Melissa said, as Amanda said, an associate investigator for research for MHCR, and a member of the Think Peace Learning and Support Hub. In the last couple of years, I have been quite active supporting transitional justice processes in two countries that are quite different: Colombia in South America and Mali in West Africa. The only thing that they had in common is that they were negotiating an end to very vicious armed conflict, and that in the context of that negotiation, these countries created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which looked quite different, but faced similar questions, as we're going to see. Apart from Colombia and Mali, that have been probably my most pressing engagements in the last couple of years, I have been supporting also activists in Nicaragua, people who were opposing the government of Daniel Ortega in that country, and who are now, most of them, in exile, and are trying to support initiatives of truth and memory to document the kind of violations that they suffered in their country. And finally, something that I think is quite relevant for this conversation is that I have been supporting also transitional justice processes in the United States. In the last few years, particularly after the killing of George Floyd, several cities and other communities in the US have launched commissions that work on different aspects of racial justice. Some of them are working on truth-seeking and memory. For example, not so far from where you are, the state of Maryland established a truth commission to look into the history of lynchings. Then there are other cities that have established reparations initiatives to support descendants of African slavery. And then there are, of course, processes all over the United States on memory, because certainly in the US, the question of what to teach about the past has become in itself a battleground. And so I'm very, very interested in how transitional justice may indicate a few clues into the struggle for racial justice in the US. So very, very happy or excited to be in this conversation.
I appreciate you both. Thank you so much for being here. Right now, I'm going to start off with our questions. So the first question we have is, how has transitional justice helped Latin American countries heal from trauma?
Right.
I guess the question is, has transitional justice helped Latin American countries heal from trauma, right? So I think it depends on what day you ask me. Some days I see the glass half full, and other days I see the glass half empty. Part of it is because these are not static processes. There's a lot of change. And you, in your introductory remarks, Amanda, you yourself mentioned that when you were talking about the Argentinian case, where first there was this big impetus at the point of transition to democracy, there was, the government created this Truth Commission. Really the first of it, there had been one previous one in Bolivia, but never really produced a report. Nothing really came of it. This is the first time a Truth Commission actually produced a meaningful and significant report. And then there was the trial of the 9 junta members, 5 of whom were found guilty and sent to jail. I mean, that was really quite unheard of in Latin America. But then a few years later, after the military uprisings and whatnot, the government backtracked and imposed these amnesty laws, and suddenly the crimes of the past were cloaked in this just veil of impunity, and even those few military officials who had been prosecuted were set free. They were pardoned and set free. And so for many years you had no responsibility. People were very frustrated, though they continued mobilizing and seeking alternative pathways to obtain justice. That sometimes involved going to international courts or regional courts like the Inter-American Commission and Court for Human Rights, or literally to international courts and using doctrines like universal jurisdiction to try to get people prosecuted elsewhere, since they couldn't be prosecuted back at home, until eventually in 2005, literally more than 20 years later, the process shifts again radically, and you start to have this incredible cascade of transitional justice trials. And it's actually now it's more like 15 or 1600 perpetrators have been prosecuted and convicted in Argentina. It's really quite a stunning story. Guatemala, Guatemala and Peru, really, which are 2 other places where I work, they've done incredible things in terms of transitional justice that I think have real meaning. Both Peru and Guatemala, after very intense internal armed conflicts in which historical legacies of racism were played out in the conflicts in both cases. In Guatemala, I think it was 8 out of 10. In Peru, I think it was 3 out of 4 victims were indigenous and rural campesinos, right? Showing how heavily the burden of the war fell on the backs of poor rural indigenous people, sort of a legacy of colonialism and so forth. But both had truth commissions that investigated the past, that brought to light both these historic patterns of racism, that called for integral reparations for all victims, not just victims of one or the other side, but for all victims, even though that did not come to pass. The reparations process has been, there's a little bit more limitations put on it in the Peruvian case in particular. And they called for prosecutions. And both Peru and Guatemala, and this again is quite unusual, they put former dictators on the docket. Peru put Alberto Fujimori on trial. Guatemala put former dictator Efraín Ríos Montt on trial for genocide. And they both managed to convict these men. Now, in the case of Guatemala, a higher court overturned the ruling, and Ríos Montt ended up being re-prosecuted, but he ended up dying before a new verdict could be handed down. So that's a backtracking in a way. Peru, Fujimori was actually let free. He was pardoned in 2017. So one of those moments where I definitely saw the glass half full, but victims mobilized, human rights organizations like the one I work at mobilized, and we went to the Inter-American Court and they said, no, Peru, you cannot free Fujimori. It's a violation of the rights of the victims. And he was sent, I mean, it's really quite astounding. He was sent back to prison. He is still in prison to this day. So not that I enjoy someone being in prison, but he committed massive violations of human rights and he is paying for his crimes. And that's a key pillar of the transitional justice process. The thing that really upsets me about transitional justice is we seem to not quite have figured out, and maybe this is impossible, I don't know, the new narratives that are written by truth commissions that are trying to establish the truth about what happened, right? They're not completely accepted by the societies for which they are intended, right? So in the case of Peru, just to give an example, the Peruvian army wrote its own version of the truth, quote unquote, and published it. And they actually called it "En honor a la verdad," in honor of the truth. And they basically contradict several of the key several of the key findings of the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In other words, they challenge the truth that the Truth Commission sought to establish sort of once and for all. This is the truth about what really happened, not what we've been told all these years by the dictators and the media that was bought by the dictators. But today in Peru, where there's massive social convulsion going on, we're seeing things, we're seeing manifestations of racism. We're hearing people say, oh, just kill them, they're all terrorists. And those are the kinds of things people would say in the context of a war against a very violent insurgent movement. There is no such violent insurgent movement today in Peru. So it's even, to my mind, it's even more shocking to hear this kind of language, this kind of discourse, urging the government to murder people who are peacefully protesting for political change. So, and I could go on and on about this. I have other examples from Guatemala, but I don't want to usurp the time that we have. So I'll just wrap it up by saying, I think that transitional justice has done an incredible amount. And it's important that there are transitional justice processes because these are mechanisms by which victims can at last have their rights, at least to some degree, vindicated, to have their voices heard, to have their stories told, to try to achieve justice, to try to find out what happened to their missing loved ones, to try to see accountability done, to try to get reparations. All that is critical. But it seems that transitional justice comes up short at a more fundamental level of societal transformation. And there has been a lot of critique in the literature about this. I'm not sure we necessarily have really theorized this lacuna in how we think about transitional justice or how we think about post-conflict processes. I think maybe it goes beyond the TJ literature and we're moving into conflict resolution literature. I'm not that sure, but I'll sort of wrap it up there and pass it on over to Eduardo. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question. I will continue where Jo-Marie left. Indeed, speaking about trauma in the context of transitional justice forces you to think a lot because, of course, it's a concept that comes from a different intellectual realm. It comes from the field of psychology, of healing, while transitional justice is deeply involved with law. And so you would say that in law, probably the only way to look at trauma is to look at some form of harm. And as a form of harm, it is responded to with different measures that are probably reparative. But I think that we should be more ambitious with how we look at trauma. Because when you think of it, trauma really is some kind of an inevitable byproduct of how power works and how history works. That is the powerful engage in conflict, decide conflict, determine how conflict is going to be fought, how conflict is going to end. They, on top of that, have used to write the books about that particular history And the ones that are left dealing with the consequences are those who don't appear in the final picture, right? You have a massive, horrific conflict. You have two men, usually men, shaking hands in front of the global community, New York Times. And so it's like these situations where, as a byproduct of industry, you have pollution, contamination of all kinds. Here we go. Just as I was getting in the metaphor. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Eduardo, your connection is really unstable. Do you think maybe you can close out and log back in?
Maybe you can turn your camera off and keep the audio going.
All right. Okay, how is that now? Is it better now?
I think so.
Would that work? Okay. So what I was saying is, think of those cases of
Oh no. Eduardo, we've lost you. Can you hear us? I think I'm not sure what we should do here.
He's hopping back into the meeting again. Let's see.
Yeah.
Okay, I am trying to connect with my cell phone, which sometimes has a better connection here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
That's lucky. All right. Let me see if I can also connect these pods. It would be better. Okay, can you hear me now? Excellent, thank you. So I'm trying again to go at the specific metaphor I was trying to use. So this is, to me, very similar to those cases when you have a polluting industry poisoning the terrain or a river or the water or the air, and pretending that the costs of cleaning up this pollution are those of the population that lives around the factory. And that is, the benefit is kept with that industry, the costs are socialized. People need to deal with that in their own individual manner. If they are lucky, they will have some form of dealing with trauma. If they are not, well, tough luck. That is what happens. And of course, societies have ways of dealing with trauma. Societies do have instruments for some form of resilience. So art can be a form of resilience, for example, right? In Peru, in my country, you can find communities representing through dance battles that took place hundreds of years ago between Spaniards and Incas, and then a couple hundred years ago between Peruvians and Chileans. And now the same communities are using those battles, those carnivalesque representations to reproduce the fights between demonstrators and the police. Religion can be another form of dealing with trauma at a societal level. So those cultural forms of dealing with trauma have always existed. The difference, I think, is that transitional justice is one instrument to try to recognize trauma in the political sphere, in the public sphere, and to give the voices of victims a certain dignity, a certain credibility that they have not had in the past. So certainly there's no transitional justice process that is going to recognize each and every story, punish each and every perpetrator, repair each and every harm. But certainly, at the very least, what transitional justice does, and particularly truth commissions do, is to enlarge the public sphere, enlarge the conversation, so that certain issues that were never recognized as significant, as important, and certain voices that were never included in the past have to be included now. Now, so to go back to the example of Fujimori and Fujimorismo, etc. So, yeah, I mean, in another situation, probably a writer would have written an excellent book about the dictatorship, and it would be read and well known among the literate classes of society, right? But it's a very different thing when a truth commission happens, trials happen, reparations processes happen, and the state itself has to recognize that this took place. And that has an effect also on how the population thinks regarding the past. The daughter of Alberto Fujimori has been defeated 3 times in her aspirations to become the president of Peru. She always had significant following, and you can say, well, that is probably the sign of the glass half empty. Yeah, but she lost for a few votes, for a couple of thousand votes in each election, right? For a 0.1% of difference, perhaps, with the competitor. So if the work of transitional justice convinced 0.1% of people to think that something is better than a dictatorship, well, then that, I think, is an effect, is an impact. And probably it did. And now, does it heal? I don't know. I don't think that we could ask anything, particularly a legal measure, to heal people. Does it contribute? Probably it is a contributive factor, right? And but I do think that at the very least, making it visible, making it an issue in the national agenda, may put us in a better path towards healing.
Can I just follow up one idea? Because the healing part is something I didn't really address. And what Eduardo just said made me think of something, and it goes back to something that Amanda, you were talking in your intro comments about the Sepursarco criminal trial in Guatemala, in which 15 Quechua indigenous women brought charges against. It wasn't more people, but in the end, the prosecutor's office decided to prosecute 2 military officials who stood accused of sexual violence, sexual slavery, and domestic slavery against these women for several years during the 1980s. Their husbands were first disappeared, and then the women were taken basically as the slaves of the military and the soldiers, and were used basically as their slaves for many, many years. 37 years later, it's a very long time. It's hard to see how something that took so long to achieve can be healing. But I sat in a courtroom watching those women testify. I've spoken with them ever since. We had some of them come to Washington, D.C. last fall. They received the WOLA Human Rights Prize. We took them to meet with members of the U.S. Senate, with members of the U.S. Department of State, to talk about their process, to talk about how important the trial was for their healing process, and not just for their individual healing, but for the healing of their families and of their entire community. It doesn't mean things are picture perfect in their community. There are still members of their community who believe the story of the military, who believe that these women were prostitutes, who do not see them as victims of sexual violence, who question their stories, who question the veracity of what they're saying. But I would say the verdict itself it creates a sort of a judicial truth and therefore a societal truth that lends a credence to their story that is really critical for their own healing, but also for society's ability to sort of process what happened. Until that trial, Guatemalans didn't really think about or talk about the way the army used sexual violence as a weapon of war, rape as a weapon of war. After that trial, a lot of people started talking about it, being aware of it. And that also contributes to healing for the women, for their communities, and for the broader society, because the women feel, it's sort of like the Me Too movement here. Finally, people are believing what we've been saying all these years. A court believed what we were saying. So society, therefore, is now listening to us. They're hearing us. And that's profoundly transformative, even if it doesn't change the hearts of all Guatemalans or all people, right? So I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thank you both very much. So this next question is, based on your own practices, how would you define successes and failures in transitional justice?
Oh God, that's a question I hate. Eduardo, why don't you start that one?
All right. Well, first of all, two things to say before the consideration of what is failure or success. The first one is that there are things, and this applies to justice, for example, which you don't do because you are going to succeed. There are things that you do because they are correct, because they're the right things to do. That is, the criteria of validity for something that is normative orientation, such as justice, is different than the criteria of validity for something that is strategic, that is focused on a specific objective, right? I really hated when I was in ICTJ this kind of question of demonstrating success, because I honestly think that there are things that you don't do because you're going to be successful, right? But that you do because they are right. If you only did things in the terrain of justice because you're going to be successful, you probably wouldn't take half of the trials there, because they're very difficult to win, right? And you're going to, by definition, be defeated. And so probably, human rights defenders and others would refuse to get into that struggle because they're going to lose. And who wants not to be successful? That's absurd to me. So first of all, right? So to me, I challenge even the basis of the question. Now, if I were to engage on the question, and I have been forced to engage on the question with the question in the past, I would first make a distinction between the results of transitional justice at the end of the process. What are the deliverables, so to speak? Whether you indeed were able to publish a Truth Commission report, were able to put some perpetrators in jail and so on, and what happens in the process. And I think that to answer about failure or success, you should focus on both the end results and the process. And I think that the process has certain validity, meaning what discussions have started in a society. How has culture been impacted by a process of transitional justice? And I think in that regard, probably transitional justice success or failure, first, is going to come mixed. It's going to be part of how societies evolve and how in societies authoritarian and democratic tendencies continue their dialectic. And second, what transitional justice is going to do is to, if it is done correctly, if it has the deliverables it needs to have, if it reaches out to people as it should, then it probably will achieve a measure of success. And that success, however, should also be measured in ways that are sensitive to what we are talking about. It's not just numbers. It's not just how much money did you deliver in reparation, how much money or how many perpetrators did you punish, right? I mean, imagine that you were to apply measures of success to another kind of atrocity that you may be closer to in the US, 9/11, right? So imagine that you were to reduce 9/11 to how many perpetrators were tried, how much money was disbursed to relatives of the people who died in 9/11. What would that give you? That will give you numbers, but would that be enough to say that the US was successful dealing with the consequences of 9/11? I don't think the question would be wisely put in that way, right? I think you will have to look into more sensitive and smarter indicators of what does it mean for a society to deal, in this case, with terror, right? And that would probably go beyond what particularly happened in the disbursement of monies or in the prosecution of a few figures in international terror.
I really like Eduardo's answer because I think what he's pointing to is the fact that while a lot of transitional justice is about, very specific policies and programs, whether we're talking about, creating, a more complete historical narrative, or prosecuting perpetrators of human rights abuses, or providing reparations for victims, at root, what we're talking about are unspeakable acts of terror, right? Committed against individuals and communities. And so to talk about success or failure is sometimes it feels a little too far removed from the very profound pain that's been inflicted upon individuals and communities, right? So I really like his answer in trying to distinguish between different ways of thinking about that kind of a question. On the other hand, I do think there sometimes you can talk about, oh, this policy was, this was a pretty successful endeavor and it made a difference. And I'm just going to give you one example. In 2000, after 10 decades in power, Alberto Fujimori, who we've already talked about, after 10 years as, the dictator of Peru, under whom massive human rights violations occurred, he fled Peru. He went to Japan, the home of his parents, where he lived for several years in relative comfort and safe from prosecution. The Japanese government granted him citizenship, and never really paid any attention to the Peruvian government's requests to have him extradited. And there were family members of human rights abuses committed during his government, and a couple of very dedicated human rights organization. And there's one person in particular I have to name because he's a good friend of Eduardo's and mine, Francisco Soberon, known as Pancho, who passed away very recently. Pancho mobilized the victims and the human rights community in Peru, and the international human rights community as well, to pursue Fujimori's extradition. In Japan, when Fujimori left Japan for Chile, probably the biggest mistake of his life, he was eventually extradited back to Peru and put on trial. And I remember sitting in a room with some folks and someone saying, when we saw Pancho Soberon going to Japan, going to Chile, insisting on getting Fujimori extradited, we thought, that's never going to happen. That's a pipe dream. He's crazy. But sometimes crazy makes change. And Pancho's crazy. I'm sorry. I'm inflecting that with a little bit of Spanish. Sorry. Pancho's crazy was that he believed 100% in human rights, and he dedicated his life to working on behalf of victims. And that kind of crazy brought Fujimori back to Peru, put him on trial, got him convicted, and sent him to jail. It did not necessarily alleviate entirely the suffering of the people whose loved ones were killed or disappeared by Fujimori, but there was some level of satisfaction at seeing him answer for his crimes. And so, it's hard to call something a success when it means a man has to spend 25 years in jail. But that our system of justice, especially when we're talking about mass atrocity crimes, that's what is called for. So I do think sometimes it's worth thinking about it in those terms. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you both. Our final question is, what can the United States learn from transitional justice processes?
I think Eduardo should take this question. He's really the one who's been working. I might have some comments at the end, but he's really been working on this. I think he can bring a lot of insights to that question.
Eduardo, you're muted.
I was thinking the vote of confidence. So, well, I think that it's interesting because I was talking about that today with a very good friend, Dave Ragland, who leads an organization called the Truth Telling Project. It's an organization that he created together with now Congresswoman Cori Bush from Missouri. And they created that after the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson. And initially, this was just a space where families whose relatives were killed by police in racist incidents came together to speak about what had happened. That is, it was mostly some kind of an oral history project, some kind of a mutual support space for families who have suffered this kind of injustice. And through that process, Dave Ragland himself and many other activists have come to start using concepts that have come directly from transitional justice. In some cases, you can see a specific search that happened within the Black community. So, for example, transitional justice aroused some interest in Black liberation movements and in Black empowerment movements because of the case of South Africa and the liberation of South Africa from apartheid in the 1990s. The fact that the Truth Commission was established in South Africa was very inspirational for many racial justice activists in the United States. The Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission of North Carolina, which looked into racial justice, racial violence in that city, was directly inspired by the South African Commission. And I think now these initiatives that are multiplying across the country have to do now more clearly with concepts of transitional justice. So people are starting to use concepts such as truth seeking and looking directly into truth commissions and the experience of truth commissions around the world. And people are also looking into concepts like reparation. And they are trying to look at this particular very complicated concept, not just in a purely, I would say, American form of looking at reparation. That is reparation as a result of a lawsuit, reparation as monetary compensation. People are starting to use a more ambitious sense of reparation. Reparation as historical reparation for the harms inflicted on African slavery and the descendants of that crime against humanity. And so I think that what transitional justice does is to offer a series of instruments that can be explored in an integral response to the consequences of a crime. That is very, very important in a place like the US, because I think the US has a number of cultural quirks, some particular obsessive thoughts that are sometimes not terribly useful to look into the historical past. One is, for example, this notion of exceptionality, right? we are so different from the rest of the world, and we have nothing to learn from the rest of the world. And that is not true, right? Just like the South African Truth Commission example shows, or the fact that, you know, a modest country like Peru, a modest country like Guatemala were able to put in jail and to try, right, perpetrators of genocide, crimes against humanity, things that the United States has not done. In some cases, I'm not even talking about presidents, right? But I'm speaking about other officials that, you know, were accused of these kind of crimes. So there are things that could be learned from around the world. Another quirk that I think is very particular in the US is the obsession of the US with criminal justice. I think I know no other country where trials are a form of public entertainment, right? There are TV shows about trials, TV shows about judges, and there is an entire genre of movies and books about criminal justice, right? And I think that criminal justice, while useful and important, is not the only thing in which transitional justice focuses. Transitional justice explains, I think, that criminal justice has a number of limitations from the perspective of victims, because a trial is focused on the accused, while not necessarily on the victim, on the survivor. The center of the drama in a judicial setting is the accused, whether she is going to be found guilty or not, on the basis of evidence and certain rules of engagement between the defense and the prosecutor. But transitional justice opens, I think, the possibilities of a number of other measures that are focused on the victim and survivor, right? Truth seeking, which is important for all society and is not focused only on the accused. Reparation, which is focused on the victim, on the survivor, himself, herself, right? And I think that is what transitional justice can provide in a place like the US. Now, in order to do that, TJ also needs to challenge itself, because transitional justice was established looking into fairly recent sort of conflicts in extraordinary situations, like a war, like a dictatorship. In the US, you are talking about situations that have happened over hundreds of years. That is, we're looking at historical duration and historical crimes. And so looking into that requires adjusting the framework that we're talking about. And so I do think that there are some lessons to learn. Also, I would say that in the case of transitional justice in a place like the US, you have to recognize that you are not talking about the crimes that happen in a dictatorship or a war, but that peace and democracy really can feel like a war or can feel like a dictatorship from the standpoint of certain populations. So if you are an indigenous person and your territory and your lives and your wisdom are encroached upon by settlers and your lives are destroyed, etc., then, you know, probably the fact that this country has a constitution and regular elections does not mean much from the standpoint of this particular population. So I do think that transitional justice can provide certain clues for racial justice in the US, but at the same time, it's going to be transformed. It is being transformed in that endeavor.
Yeah, I think the one element, well, there's maybe two things I might want to address in terms of thinking about the US. And one is also related to the question of criminal justice. In addition to the fact that, as Eduardo says, the US is maybe uniquely obsessed with criminal justice. I also think there's a tension in the way, especially in the post-George Floyd America, we think about these issues, right? There is a necessary demand for criminal justice for police officials in particular who commit who kill Black people, who are committing atrocities, and rightly so. At the same time, there is a growing abolitionist movement that's questioning the very fundamentals of the carceral state. And so I think there's some tensions within these two ways of thinking that we've not quite sorted out. They've not been quite sorted out. And maybe they're not, maybe it's not possible to sort them out. Maybe we just have to hold these contradictions because they respond to, they're sort of like two sides of the same problem. But I think that's something that one could discuss at much more length. And I guess one other thing that troubles me, and since I've already touched on this in my comments earlier, I'm going to raise it here. And it's the question of who gets to write history, right? One of the reasons that truth commissions, as Eduardo and I have been saying, are so powerful is that they do help provide tools for cutting through the old official narratives, often based on lies, half-truths, unknown information, to arrive at a more conclusive understanding of the past. But then we get, like in the case of Peru, the army trying to write its own version of the past. And where I'm going with this is Florida. Florida is trying to tell us as educators, as students, as a community, what we can study and what we cannot study, what books we can read and what books we cannot read. And it's not only Florida, as we know. Libraries and schools across the country are increasingly facing efforts to impose book bans, to censor books, to eliminate books altogether, whether they deal with Black liberation, whether they deal with the legacy of slavery, whether they deal with LGBTQI rights. There's a whole gamut of books that are trying to be removed, and the history rewritten, or not fully told, or I'm not really sure what's going on. But it's, as an educator, as someone who gets paid to think and to teach for a living, this strikes me as a fundamental threat to our very existence. And I want those of us here today who maybe listen to this, in some future recording, to say, what am I doing to stop this lunacy? Why is it so hard for us to talk about oppression and own up to the past abuses that have been committed in our name or in the name of some group? Unless we talk about it, unless we come to terms with it, we're going to continue to be a society that suffers divisions and violence, and maybe just, kind of implodes into these various fragments that no longer can talk to each other. Maybe we're already there. I still hold the hope that that's not true, but it sure feels like that more and more each day. And it's not just the result of one president or one election. There is a broader process at play in American society that I feel like we still have not figured out, how we deal with this, how we respond, how we come together and say, like I said a minute ago, stop this lunacy. We cannot be banning books in a democratic society. We cannot be censoring history. Anyway, so I'll leave it there, but these are things I think are really important for us as students, as teachers, as faculty, as staff at universities, as members of the community who have, students in school and so forth, to be thinking about and to be working towards figuring out how we overcome this particular moment in our history. Thanks.
Very appreciative of you both. We have a question in the chat by Dr. Schooler, and he asked, to what extent do you think the construct of truth and reconciliation turns off an American audience to fixate on accountability, retribution, and the like? Should we frame it as truth commissions that are primarily vehicles for getting a more complete story rather than also taking on the responsibility of reconciliation?
If I may take the question, at least try to take it. Thank you, Larry, for your question. Well, it's interesting because right now, on top of the numerous truth commissions that are being created in the country and the language on truth and reconciliation that is happening at the local level, there have also been proposals at the federal level, at the legislative branch, right? There are proposals for a truth and racial healing commission in the Senate and in parallel in the House, proposal for a truth commission focused on the Indian pensionates or residential schools. And interestingly, what Jo Marie was saying happened, meaning that the reaction from certain sectors was to fight about the concept of the truth, right? I remember a couple of articles, if I'm not wrong, some Fox News writer denouncing those ideas as the pretension to impose some kind of a version of history, some kind of ministry of the truth. And it's interesting because truth commissions have usually been seen as sort of soft justice, quite soft instruments. But in the telling of these opponents of the idea, the name Truth Commission took on some kind of Orwellian aspect, right? Some kind of the official formal imposition of a certain truth. And so I do think that the naming of these processes has an impact. And I think that you can probably play a bit about the fact that, speaking about reconciliation, or speaking about healing, maybe less threatening than speaking about justice. But I think that some sectors are going to oppose anyway, in whatever way you define or look into this, because they just know what is behind. They just know that eventually these are processes to try to define commonly in a society a common problem and how to deal with it. And I go back to what Jo Marie was saying. The US is a society where, a couple of generations ago, probably, you could say that on the basis of a common definition of reality, people had very severe discrepancies on how to deal with that particular reality. And that reality could be democracy, could be the economy, could be the role of the US in the world. But you have a certain definition of that and a fight on what to do about it. But right now, what Jo Marie is describing, and I'm sad to agree with, is a situation in which you don't have two alternative prescriptions on reality, but two alternative realities, right? There is some kind of a division of the world, some kind of decoupling of the world, in which the opposite political positions are going to define the world in a completely different way, so that it is impossible to even talk to each other, right? And so if that happens, if that uncoupling of concepts happen, of visions of the world happen, then most probably there is very little that any measure can do with any name, right? Because people are not going to agree on whether you are talking about history in the case of history books, or you are talking about, as some people say, conspirations to change the way, the mentality of our children, right? And you're going to be unable to talk about things like justice or freedoms or liberties. So that's a real challenge and a real problem. Think of things like dealing with police brutality, right? There is a gamut of responses to this, which start in the very fact that some people reject absolutely even the idea of there being a problem, right? And so if there are no spaces to even thematize the issue, it's going to be very difficult to find ways of using transitional justice to deal with the issue. If it is not thematized first, if it is not problematized first, it's not going to be addressed. Oh, I see Larry had to leave.
Yeah, no, I guess the only thing I would add is that coming from the Latin American experience, the word reconciliation is often looked upon with a great deal of skepticism, because for a long time, when transitions to democracy were first happening in Latin America in the 80s into the 90s, for the Argentina, where they they had their truth commission and prosecuted the generals, that was actually the exception, right? More generally speaking, you had efforts to, turn the page, not look backward, forgive and forget. Reconciliation was the language that it was kind of the fancy word that was used to kind of sugarcoat impunity that undergirded these transitions, right? Where perpetrators walked free, had no sanction whatsoever. And in fact, many of them retained substantive positions of power, political, economic, or otherwise. So, for Latin Americans, many Latin Americans, that word reconciliation is deeply problematic. And the idea that you can get to a place called reconciliation before arriving at truth and justice and some measure of reparation is impossible. So the reconciliation terms, I've always had a little bit of, allergic reaction to that term. I do know that in the US, the term restorative justice is much more prominent. It's very prominent in some circles, especially because, of the fact that we have one of the largest incarcerated populations in the world, and that it's disproportionately people of color. And so restorative justice has developed in the United States as a way of addressing this reality. So I think the point that Eduardo was making earlier, that the nature of what we're talking about in the US, this much longer historic system of racial and other oppression, maybe requires other ways of thinking outside the box, outside of the TJ box, maybe a little bit. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you both. Just reaching out to the audience to see if anyone else has any other questions you'd like to add, Dr. Burt and Eduardo. You can unmute yourselves or put them in the chat.
Could I ask Eduardo a question?
Of course.
Eduardo's in Cartagena, Colombia. Colombia is a country that has just gone through a major transitional justice, or it's going through a major transitional justice process, right? The government signed peace accords with the FARC rebels in 2016. There's an ongoing effort to sign accords with the ELN, a remaining guerrilla group, and I think Petro uses the term established total peace in Colombia. And Eduardo, you've been very deeply engaged in some of those processes. I wonder if there are any insights that you could share with us about the Colombian experience on its own merit, and then maybe in relation to the US, if you see any connection.
Thank you for that question. Well, I think that transitional justice moves on the basis of important experiences, important cases that bring a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, and a lot of creation of new things. South Africa was one of those examples, right? Even though you had truth commissions in Latin America in certain countries, when it happened in South Africa, when they explored the notion of amnesty in exchange for cooperation, it certainly captured the imagination of many people around the world, and it motivated a lot of debate. And I think the same is going to happen after the experience of Colombia. Because in South Africa, as you remember, the principle was that people who cooperated with a truth commission, that is with a non-judicial body, will receive certain benefits, specifically one benefit, amnesty from prosecution. And so it was quite blunt, right? You cooperate, you receive protection from prosecution. That particular solution is no longer feasible. International law has made a lot of progress since the 1990s, when the South African Commission was established. There is more agreement now that there are cases that simply cannot be fully forgiven, that cannot receive amnesties. So how to deal with that in the case of a peace negotiation like the one in Colombia? I mean, there was a point in which both parties wanted, honestly, to reach some form of accommodation, some form of solution. That is why they sat down around the table. But the question was what to do about the fact that both parties had committed war crimes. Because if you say to a guerrilla commander, you know, we're going to sign peace, and the next day you're going to go to jail for 60 years, well, probably you're not creating a lot of incentives there for people to leave the bush. And the same is going to happen with the generals. They are going to say, so, okay, so you sign a deal with the commanders, are you going to create them into a political party? They're probably going to be free. What happens with us? We are in jail for exactly the same crimes. And so what Colombia did was a system that I think is going to, well, there will be attempts to copy it in the same way that people have been trying to copy South Africa for decades. That is, in Colombia, they established a judicial system called the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. It's not a truth commission, an actual court of law with a prosecutor and so on, that receives the persons who are accused and gives them the chance to cooperate. And if they cooperate and they fully confess and they provide with all the information existing in good faith, then they will still be tried. They will still be sentenced, but their sentence is not going to involve incarceration. So it is a way of dealing with this particular issue that Marie was raising, because it's a restorative process. You are supposed to do things to deal with the harm that you caused, and the end result of the process is not going to be some sort of punishment, carceral punishment, but it's going to be another form of action. You are still under the vigilance of the state. You are going to not have a normal life for a number of years, but you're supposed to be doing things that help the community. And, but of course, it's not just carrots. There are also sticks in this process in Colombia, meaning that you may think that you don't want to confess anything because you don't want to, I don't know, lose face in your community. You don't want to confess that you are a war criminal. I mean, there may be, or probably you truly believe in your innocence. Well, then people who do not want to come to this system are free to not go to the system. Only if they don't, they will go to the regular justice system. And in that case, well, they are taking a huge gamble because yes, they may end victorious, they may be declared non-guilty, but if they are declared guilty of a war crime, the penal code in Colombia is quite severe. You can end up sentenced to 60 years in jail, the rest of your life. And so what has happened is that the parties in the conflict accepted this particular deal. So you have guerrillas, you have members of this FARC organization who actually had to accept the war crimes they committed and provide all the information about it in order to obtain the benefit, which is a punishment that is not carceral in nature. And you have had also soldiers, officers of the Colombian army confessing what has happened and receiving the same benefit. Is it the right thing to do? Well, that is a huge debate. You know, for some people, this is still some kind of impunity measure because you should punish these crimes in a way that is proportional to the gravity of the crime. How are you going to punish, I don't know, killing innocent peasants and presenting them as guerrillas? How are you going to punish something like that by just sending the person, I don't know, 7 years to freedom under some kind of vigilance? That's not proportional at all, right? But the Colombians decided that they are going to discuss, right? Why is it that the penalty is what it is in the criminal law system? What are the functions of the penalty? The Colombians discussed whether the penalty had as an object punishment or rehabilitation, and the Colombians have also a particular thing in their constitution, speaking about quirks. Well, in Colombia, the constitution enshrines as a constitutional right, the right to peace. So, you know, it says Colombians have a right to live in peace. And they have the same right, a right to pursue justice. In a case like this, obviously, the courts need to establish what is the right balance, because you have the right to live in peace, which requires people who are not in peace to accept the political system, to leave weapons aside, right? To abandon violent forms of politics. But in order to do that, you are going to sacrifice certain aspects of justice. What is the right balance here? That is what Colombia is doing, that I find really, really interesting, fascinating. As part of this process, a truth commission was created. It's called the Truth Clarification Commission. It was a very interesting enterprise with a lot of resources for the Truth Commission. You find millions of videos of the Truth Commission in YouTube, in their website, a huge, very authoritative report of what happened in the conflict, hundreds of meetings, dialogues, activities across the country. And I think, well, it is going to be seen what exactly is the result of this. Hopefully, the fact that other guerrillas are deciding that the game in town is no longer war may be an indication that they think that peace and these conditions of justice were acceptable. Hopefully, that will mean also for illegal economies, for other groups, options to go out of the illegal economies. And hopefully this, what happens in Colombia, may show the way to many other countries that deal with intractable conflicts. Because again, the problem is the same. The problem is, you know, be it Mali or be it, you know, the south of the Philippines or the north of Myanmar, right? Well, it may be the case that people may want to negotiate, but if the answer is all right, after the end of the negotiation, you're going to go 60 years to jail, probably they won't want that. And that in itself, you don't want to get to a situation in which justice is a factor of war. That should not be the case. Justice should complement war, not be an obstacle for peace. Should complement peace, not be an obstacle for peace, right? So yeah, that is what I think is so significant in this particular case. And I see there are a couple of other questions in the chat. Why don't you address them, Giovanni?
Yes, we're gonna end with the next question. Thank you, Eduardo. The next question is, what makes you most optimistic about the future of the global transitional justice movement?
Optimism is your
well, someone actually asked me the other day, how I maintained my optimism when there were so many setbacks, particularly in the countries that I work on very closely, Peru and Guatemala, in which, you know, the justice system is being overtaken by corrupt actors. The gains made in transitional justice, especially in Guatemala, are being, I mean, systematically broken down. Prosecutors, judges are being forced into exile, victims fear for their lives, etc. And I thought about the question because I do consider myself a generally optimistic person. But I thought about the question and I thought to myself, it's not that I'm optimistic. It's that I believe in the rights of victims. And I believe in the rights of victims because I've worked, just like Eduardo has, side by side with victims since I was in college. And when you see them and listen to them and watch them, you realize it's not really about your optimism. It's about, do you have the same level of commitment and perseverance that the victims do to walk side by side with them? Because that's what Eduardo and I do. That's what people like us who work on these issues do. We work side by side. We lend our expertise, we lend our knowledge to victims to assist in their process of achieving truth, healing, justice, non-repetition, whatever you want to call it. And so it's really about that. It's about perseverance. And so for me, my perseverance comes from those relationships that I've built over the years. My inspiration really comes from those people like Gisela Ortiz, whose brother was one of the victims of the Fujimori government, or Paulo Estrada, who I work very closely with in Guatemala, whose father and uncle were disappeared by the Guatemalan military in the mid-1980s. Eduardo, and lots of other, Pancho Soberon, who I mentioned earlier. Our job is to walk with them, is to support them. It's to go with them to hearings. It's to lobby before the UN, before the Inter-American Commission, before their own government, before our government, to do workshops with them, to share information with them. And sometimes it's just to listen to them or be friends with them. I mean, it takes many different forms. But I think that's really what it's all about. It's about, and it's something that Eduardo said earlier, it's not about, is it right or is it wrong? It's about the normative value, the value of human life, the value of human rights. If that's what you dedicate your life to, then it's really not about optimism at all. It's about just continuing to fight that good fight. It's that, it's that cliche about Sisyphus, he rolls the boulder up the hill and the boulder comes back down on him and he just starts rolling it back up again. That is the perfect metaphor for a life working for human rights. Whether as a practitioner, as Eduardo is, or as an academic, as I am, or students, as many of you are. We all have our role to play.
Little to add, just one phrase. Intellect is pessimistic by nature, right? If you think of the issue, right? If you think of all the pros and cons, etc., it's impossible not to be pessimistic. You must accept that there is going to be a certain level of pessimism of the intellect, but you are still living, right? And the survivors are still there, and so what is optimistic is the will. Is a capacity to will. So it's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. That balance, that is, I think, what we are called to do.
I love that. We'll get a little Nietzsche in there. Very good. Very, very
True.
good.
That is perfect. I am very appreciative of everyone who is on here tonight. Thank you for joining us. I am so appreciative of Dr. Burt and Eduardo. Like I admire the work you do. Good work, and excited to be a part of it.
Well, I'm going to say one more time how happy I am to see you in this role, continuing to work for human rights. It really makes me very happy. So thank you for organizing this event and for bringing us all here into conversation together.
Of course, anytime. So on behalf of MHCR and everyone else, thank you so much. We hope that you learned a lot, and have a great night.
Bye, everybody. Good night. Thank you.